Imagine waking up one morning at your peaceful lakefront cabin, only to discover that the land you've cared for, protected, and legally owned had been sold right out from under you without your knowledge, without your consent, and without a shred of legal standing. That's exactly what happened when the local HOA tried to overstep their boundaries, claiming control over property that was never theirs to begin with. What started as a quiet retreat on 1,500 acres of pristine lakefront turned into a battle over rights, land, and power. At first, it seemed almost laughable. How could a homeowners association, made up of neighbors and board members, think they had the authority to sell land they didn't own? But the paperwork they filed, the way they convinced others, and the confidence with which they acted proved this was no simple mistake. It was a calculated move, one that could have left me without the very home I built my life around. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about setting a precedent. If they could get away with this, who would be next? What they didn't expect was that I wasn't just going to roll over. Instead, I dug into the law, the county records, and every loophole they had conveniently ignored. And in the process, I uncovered something that flipped the entire situation upside down. Their attempt to claim what was mine opened the door for me to legally challenge everything they thought they controlled. In fact, by the time the dust began to settle, the HOA's bold move ended up backfiring so badly that I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was in a position to claim their entire neighborhood. But that's where things really start to get interesting. The strange part about this whole ordeal was how quietly it all began. For years, I kept to myself at the lakefront cabin, fixing the dock, fishing in the mornings, and enjoying the wide stretch of 1,500 acres that had been in my family for generations. I never joined the neighborhood HOA, never signed their agreements, and honestly, never thought much about them. Their rules and fees were for the houses across the road, not for someone living on private land by the water. At least, that's what I thought. But little by little, I started noticing signs of trouble. First, a notice nailed to a tree near my driveway claiming I was in violation of HOA regulations. Then, rumors that a group of board members were telling others that my land was community-owned property. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking no one could be bold enough to make that stick. But I was wrong. A few months later, I learned they had gone as far as filing documents with the county, pretending they had rights to parcels of my land. It wasn't just sloppy paperwork. It was a coordinated attempt to seize what didn't belong to them. I remember the exact moment I realized how deep it went. A neighbor stopped me on the road and mentioned, almost casually, that lots around my cabin were being advertised for sale through the HOA. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. They weren't just making claims, they were already selling pieces of my property to outsiders. That's when I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to fight back, but not the way they expected. Instead of arguing at meetings or shouting across fences, I decided to take a different path, one that would use their own actions against them. And once I started digging, what I uncovered changed everything. As I dug deeper into the county records, I realized the HOA hadn't just made a clerical error, they had built an entire house of cards. They filed maps showing boundaries that stretched far beyond their neighborhood, quietly including sections of my 1,500 acres as if they had owned it all along. What's worse, they were using those documents to sell lots to unsuspecting buyers who thought they were getting lakefront property. On paper, it looked legitimate, but the reality was those buyers were being sold land that legally belonged to me. The conflict wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about trust. Neighbors I had known for years suddenly started looking at me differently, as though I was the one intruding on their so-called community. Some even confronted me, insisting that the HOA had the final say over the lake and that I should fall in line like everyone else. It was strange hearing that, knowing full well my cabin stood on land that predated their entire neighborhood by decades. A smaller subplot started to take shape when I noticed that not everyone in the HOA was on the same page. A few homeowners quietly admitted they had doubts about what the board was doing, but they were afraid to speak out. They didn't want fines, harassment, or to be ostracized. One neighbor even slipped me a copy of an email chain between board members where they discussed expanding control and how they could profit from it. That was the first real crack in their plan, and it gave me just enough to keep pushing. Still, Every move I made seemed to trigger more pushback. The Ho doubled down, threatening legal action against me for trespassing on my own property. And while I stayed calm on the surface, I knew the real storm hadn't even started yet. The more evidence I uncovered, the clearer it became that the Ho had backed themselves into a corner. They had stretched their authority so far that even a small mistake could unravel everything. I filed quiet inquiries with the county clerk and requested certified copies of every document tied to my property. When the papers came back, side by side with my original deeds, the differences were undeniable. They had forged boundaries, shifted lot lines, and even stamped approvals that didn't match county records. It wasn't just sloppy, it was reckless. Word began to spread, and tension in the neighborhood hit a boiling point. Some homeowners grew nervous, realizing the land they thought they bought from the home might not even exist. Others rallied harder behind the board, convinced I was trying to dismantle their community. Meetings turned chaotic, with shouts echoing across the lake late into the night. Cars slowed in front of my cabin, strangers snapping photos, as though I had become the villain in their story. Behind closed doors, I prepared my own strategy. I wasn't just defending what was mine anymore. I was carefully stacking every piece of evidence, waiting for the moment to turn it all back on them. The irony was almost too perfect. The same legal tricks they had used to claim my land were the very loopholes that now gave me leverage over their neighborhood. But the closer I got to exposing the truth, the more aggressive the Ho became. They served me with letters demanding I vacate parts of my own property. They even posted signs warning others that I was trespassing. Each move felt desperate, like they knew the walls were closing in. And then came the breaking point, the moment when everything we'd been building toward was about to erupt, and there was no turning back. Just when I thought I had the Ho cornered, the story took an unexpected turn. While combing through more county records, I discovered something even more shocking than the forged boundary lines. Buried deep in old filings was a decades-old easement that the Ho had never mentioned, an agreement that technically tied their entire neighborhood to my property. It was a forgotten document, signed long before most of the homes were even built, granting access rights and shared usage under conditions that had never been honored. Suddenly, their whole community wasn't just encroaching on my land. They were legally dependent on it. That revelation changed everything. What started as a fight to protect my 1,500 acres had now escalated into a battle where I held far more leverage than I ever imagined. If I enforced that easement, the HOA's entire neighborhood would face restrictions they couldn't afford to ignore. Roads, utilities, even access to the lake, all of it traced back through rights that technically flowed from my property. And the best part? They had overlooked it for years, so confident in their false authority that they never bothered to check the fine print. When I confronted them with this discovery, their response wasn't denial, it was panic. I could see it in the way board members scrambled, calling emergency meetings, whispering in corners, and rushing to find lawyers who might spin the situation in their favor. The homeowners who had once been so sure of their power now seemed nervous, asking me questions they never thought they'd have to ask. But the panic only made the atmosphere more dangerous. The Ho wasn't about to give up control quietly, and I knew exposing this twist would only make the final showdown that much more explosive. The real fight was only just beginning. The showdown came faster than I expected. The Ho called an emergency meeting at the community hall, and word spread quickly that they were preparing to take legal action against me. I walked in carrying nothing but a binder full of county records, deeds, and that forgotten easement document. The room was packed with homeowners, some glaring at me, others watching nervously, clearly unsure whose side to take. When the board members stood up and accused me of trespassing and interfering with community property, I finally laid everything out on the table. I showed the original deed proving my ownership of the 1,500 acres. I held up certified maps exposing how they had redrawn boundaries. And finally, I presented the easement, proof that their neighborhood wasn't just overstepping, but actually tied to my land for access and utilities. The room went silent. Even the most vocal supporters of the shifted uneasily in their seats. For the first time, the board didn't have an answer. Their threats collapsed under the weight of hard evidence, and the homeowners saw the truth with their own eyes. The very documents they had ignored for years had given me the legal right not just to protect my cabin, but to claim authority over the entire neighborhood. But just as it seemed everything was resolved, one more twist surfaced. A county official who had been quietly reviewing the situation revealed that because of the HOA's fraudulent filings, their charter had been invalidated. Legally, the HO no longer existed. All their rules, fines, and claims were void. The same organization that tried to erase my rights had erased itself instead. The battle was over, but the irony was almost too perfect. By trying to steal my land, the HO had lost everything. In the weeks that followed, the lakefront finally felt calm again. With the HO dissolved, the constant stream of threats, fines, and notices stopped overnight. Homeowners who had once been caught in the middle started reaching out to me, not with anger this time, but with questions about what came next. Many of them admitted they never agreed with the board's extreme actions but felt powerless to push back. Now, without the HO looming over them, they were free to live without fear of every small detail being policed. For me, it was less about victory and more about relief. My 1,500 acres were safe, my cabin was secure, and the truth was finally out in the open. I had fought not just for my land, but for the principle that no group, no matter how organized, could strip away rights that were never theirs. The irony was that in trying to control everything, the HO ended up losing control of themselves. Their own greed and overreach had destroyed the very power they thought was untouchable. Some neighbors began forming a community association built on cooperation instead of control, this time without overstepping boundaries. A few even apologized for the way things unfolded, realizing they'd been misled. As for me, I decided to keep to the simple life I'd always valued, fishing on the lake in the mornings, maintaining the cabin, and enjoying the peace of the land my family had entrusted to me. The whole ordeal left me with one clear lesson. Sometimes the best defense isn't shouting louder, but patiently stacking truth until it outweighs every lie. In the end, the lake remained mine, the cabin still stood strong, and the neighborhood finally learned where the real lines were drawn.